really interested to see how many people would turn up for the business segment. There's quite a lot of people here. So we are going to be talking, continue the theme. It works quite well to dovetail in with what Henry was talking about, clinical trials and getting to a regulatory license. We're going to continue the theme about products or psychotherapeutic therapies which ultimately may have a regulatory license, and what happens from that point onwards, and how do we bridge the gap or the steps from a regulatory license to actual patient access. So we're going to just stay in that, well, it's not narrow, but the more narrow part of access for psychedelic therapy. So as Ryan mentioned, my background is in working with developers of medicines, including mental health medicines, over the past 15 years. So I've walked the path of trying to get funding for medicines, and it's a long path. You know, even for products which have gone what we could say is beyond clinical promise in trials, and they've actually got a license. It's a long path to those patients getting access across European countries, and even for products with very good clinical outcomes, only a proportion of countries are going to have good access to those medicines. And it can take, from a few weeks to a few years to go through that process. So we want to talk about that access gap today, about how do you bridge that. And for psychedelics, there's some extra complications and complexities to add into that, which we need to think about now, not at the point that they may receive a license. The insights today are a small segment of insights that we've collected through a recent report that's been published a few weeks ago. I'll give you the details at the end of the presentation on where you can access that. It's free to access. It was a joint effort co-authored between myself and Flores from Blossom Analysis, who's here with us today as well. And also, I've got a problem on the screen. Okay, we've got something that's come up that's covering the part of the slide. I don't know if you can get rid of that. I'll look up here. We also have significant contributions from Tadeusz from Perea, Josh from Psychedelic Alpha, and also Victor Chavatel and Samudu Aboina from Psychedelics Europe. We've been collaborating over the last 9 months to prepare this report. As I said, this is just a segment of it, and we're going to focus today more about the UK. The report was supported by Norsk Mind. It was a project grant to help with this, and it's a European-wide focus with looking at some specific countries. But we think it may be the first Europe-wide payer-focused publication. And it's been designed for both developers, healthcare professionals, thank you, payers, policymakers, and patients to all be able to dip into parts of that report and different chapters. So the report objectives include providing a bit of a map for what the reimbursement landscape looks like, in particular for 4 countries, the UK, Germany, the Netherlands, and the Czech Republic. We wanted to collect insights from a broad range of stakeholders, so payers, of course, because we're talking about reimbursement, but healthcare professionals, patient representatives, other clinical or interested stakeholders. And we were trying to map out what's the pathway and what are the particular challenges we see, which may be relevant to all medicines, but there's some which are specific to psychedelic therapies. And we've tried to build out some strategies based on the insights that we collected and discussion points for how to move this forward, how to move the discussion forward. Very briefly, let's simplify this from a European level. There are, we could say, 6 key steps from licensing to use within a national health service or a clinic that's under, say, a federal insurance system. We are looking at the marketing authorization probably at a regional level for most European countries. Then you have to receive the appropriate licensing at a national level. Then for most countries now, products are going to go through a health technology assessment to assess the value of those medicines, and then that will move into a pricing and reimbursement negotiation to agree the criteria, in which case, in where a therapy will be reimbursed. There will be some contracting between the payers and the clinic providers about how those funds and payments are made and what's the protocols or the appropriate care that will be reimbursed. And then we also need to think about infrastructure readiness. Is there any changes to the infrastructure or the health pathway that need to be put in place before a product can be provided? And we've distilled that down into 5 key sets of challenges. And we're not focusing today on the first of those, but we just need to acknowledge that there is regulatory complexity, and Henry's helped outline that today. And that's both in getting regulatory approval, but also what is the situation for national drug controls. So we're assuming that both of those hurdles are passed for this discussion. We have to look at evidence challenges. Now, these challenges here are specific to psychedelic therapies. So, as Henry said, there's some non-standard trial methodologies used to try and create quality evidence, and in particular to help with blinding. But those create some challenges for the payers as well, because that's not what they're used to seeing. And there is challenges in generating comparative effectiveness. So being able to look at how the study data would compare to the current standard of care in a country. And also for psychedelic therapies, the longer term treatment effect is a particular challenge. It's an opportunity, but it's a challenge from an evidence perspective about how medium to long term outcomes could be estimated and considered by payers as providing value to the health service. Health technology assessment methodology, HTA methodology. There are whole companies who work around understanding the methodology and guiding developers through this process. But in particular, these have been designed mainly for more simple drug compounds. So if you have drug plus psychotherapy, psychotherapeutic support, not all HTAs are really built for doing that sort of combination style therapy or the assessment. The comparative effectiveness is a key part of most HTAs. And again, as I said before, that ability to compare something in clinic with something in real world setting is challenging for psychedelics. And also, there's different concepts of value for different payers. All will look at direct value, clinical outcomes for patients. Indirect value, things such as societal, economic impacts. A few may, most don't. So you lose potentially some of the value that exists when they assess it. And when I talk about this, we're talking about the view from the payers who are making the decisions about access. Obviously, there's going to be economic considerations for payers, and economic hurdles include high upfront costs, or at least their perception, payers, of high upfront costs. So we're talking here about a patented or protected branded medicine. And we're also talking about staffing, specialised staffing, and monitoring needs. And it's all relative in the payer eyes, because it's relative to what's the cost today. And in a lot of mental health conditions, patients are being treated with very low cost generic medicines. So the comparative difference in costs is high, and it's front loaded as well. And then we need to think about infrastructure gaps. And there are infrastructure gaps for use of psychedelic therapies. They wouldn't be able to be used today, widespread, in a national health service because of those gaps. So, and a need for therapeutic spaces, dedicated therapeutic spaces, trained professionals, and also this is in the context of health systems, and we heard it through the report. Nearly every health system, the HCPs flagged that there was challenges in staffing levels and availability of staffing to be able to bring in new treatments. So there's a balancing act here. A lot of work's going in to show the clinical promise around remission rates, rapid relief, but there needs to be a balance here about when it's presented to payers and insurers around, are the infrastructure needs, are the costs appropriate? Is this achievable? Is it worth their reimbursement versus reimbursing another therapy? Because they can't reimburse everything is what it boils down to. So in the UK, we'll focus on the UK now and onwards. In the UK, Their health technology assessment is a national process which nearly all licensed drugs will be put into automatically. We have NICE in England and Wales. We have the SMC in Scotland. These are both health technology assessment groups that follow a defined process, partly public, published methodologies, outlined what their evidence expectations are. And to simplify what success looks like is that they're looking to ascertain whether therapy is good value for money or not. And their methodologies have thresholds, and they both use in the UK cost per quality adjusted life year, which is a cost effectiveness analysis, which is effectively saying they're willing to pay for medicines which provide additional quality of life or reduce mortality, but there's a limit to how much they will pay for that. And their methodologies work that out so they can look at all medicines in a similar way and say, does it come under that threshold or not? And if it's over that threshold and it's not recommended, there is almost no access for those medicines in the UK. So there's some opportunities though. So for a cost effectiveness analysis, which is what would happen in the UK, they do acknowledge quality of life as a value scale, which is obviously very relevant and for psychedelic therapies. They will look at benefits to the health system, as in do patients not need to come back into the health system as much as other patients. They will acknowledge any cost savings related to that. They will allow comparisons, indirect treatment comparisons, and by that we mean they don't necessarily need to see a study which is head-to-head, the drug in question versus the standard of care, which is more flexible than some countries, but the ability to show that indirect analysis has a lot of restrictions and clear methodology about how that can be done. And then also an important bit is that actually, because they look at everything in cost effectiveness, the fact that it's a drug plus potentially psychotherapeutic support isn't in itself necessarily an issue. It might be in other countries, but they can do drug and therapy in the UK probably better than a number of other countries could in their HTA. There are some challenges though. In particular, how do you compare the psychedelic therapy in question to the standard of care, especially if it hasn't been studied specifically against that standard of care in clinical studies? I mentioned about relative cost. So this bit around, we could call it cost anchoring. They will be looking at how much does it cost them currently. And if it's an intervention in an area such as depression, where patients, the majority of patients are being treated with antidepressants, which are pence per day, then they're looking at it compared to that. And that is a real challenge. That means that actually there's a penalty, it's not so much a penalty, but any innovative medicine coming in is going to have difficulty demonstrating cost effectiveness against something which is so cheap, even if it has clinical benefit. And that also means that more clinic time, so if there is more psychotherapeutic support and those longer dosing sessions, these all add to costs, which also create more of a challenge to meet those cost effectiveness thresholds. So it's not necessarily, the HTA is not necessarily about assessing what is the best way to deliver the care. It's just looking at the protocol or the license that's there. How much would it cost to implement that in the NHS today? So as I said before, if there's no HTA approval or a recommendation to reimburse, access is going to be very difficult to have through the NHS, and you could find that it's out-of-pocket costs or access only. If you do get a positive recommendation, you still have to look at, is there a gap from the HTA approval to the actual clinic setup and patient access? And for some drugs, it's literally a switch in, switch out to another drug that's there. But I think we could all appreciate that for psychedelic therapies, that's not going to be the case. There will be this gap around making sure there's clinical infrastructure in place, dedicated clinics, that there are staff that are available, the staff have been trained, that all the funding streams are aligned. And by that I mean, especially in the NHS, the clinic may come out of one funding pot, the psychotherapeutic support out of another, the drug out of another, and you have to get those aligned. And you also have to have an integrated care pathway. So there might be different providers involved, definitely different healthcare professionals, and that protocol needs to be very clear and very well understood before access will take place. And finally, there'll be some extra additional pieces put in for regulatory compliance, for sure, around psychedelic therapies. Even if they've been rescheduled for access, there will still be extra elements which need to be followed. So these all mean that it's not just about the HTA, the local access piece is as important. So I just wanted to share some insights around a pilot that is being set up currently, which is, and the reason why I want to share it is that it does a good job of showing actually all those bits around challenges around local care implementation. How might you set up a service or a pathway which is the path of least resistance and bringing in less cost and less complexity into the health service, which increases the likelihood of people being clear about the costs or the low levels of costs, and also being able to scale across the UK. So with the permission of David Erezzo from Imperial, we're sharing a couple of slides here about a pilot which he has been developing for ketamine in treatment-resistant depression patients. So this pilot is going to identify 10 patients with treatment-resistant depression who are currently in the NTTS, the National Talk and Therapy Service. And psychiatrists from Imperial will work with the NTTS psychologist and also an appropriate pharmacist to identify these 10 patients and to bring them in for ketamine treatment at the Cyprus clinic at Imperial College. And the proposal, or the protocol here, is for 5 weekly dosings of ketamine in a dedicated ketamine room. But in parallel, these patients are sitting within this NTTS service. So they are already getting talking therapy or access to talking therapy. So they would have 10 to 12 sessions of talking therapy and just enter the Cyprus clinic for the ketamine treatment. Now, what's useful about this and thinking about how this helps with access is that this is taking patients who are on an existing care pathway. So if you don't introduce a whole new care pathway, well, that's great, because you can talk about the care pathway that exists. It means it's more efficient, from a cost and time perspective. You're not bringing in new staff, apart from to help with the administration and dosing of the drug itself. And also very important to the NHS and to the UK is this desire to keep patients in the community as much as possible and not be spending time in a secondary care service in the hospital service. And this pilot allows patients to come from this community-based talk and therapy service, enter the hospital or the clinic for the treatment, and go back into that NTTS and be discharged ultimately back to the GPs. So it's meaning that you're not bringing in lots of new patients into the hospital-based service, which is high cost and also limited capacity. So we'll keep an eye on this pilot. I hope it goes well and it shows that this can happen efficiently and potentially be rolled out to other trusts in the UK. And this will be a really interesting one to look at, to see what can we learn from pilots like this that could be applied to psychedelic therapies coming in future years, and try and replicate some of the sort of efficiencies that have been achieved here, or hopefully achieved. So key takeaways for this part before we share some recommendations. Takeaways are HTA in the UK is almost certainly mandatory for licensed therapies, unless something changes in the next 4 or 5 years. There is a mismatch between the evidence that's been generated, or how evidence is generated for psychedelic therapies, and what the HTA methods that exist today. And that needs to be looked at now, and not at the point that a psychedelic therapy enters the actual HTA. And there is an advantage for seeking reimbursement of having lean protocols or low intensity psychotherapeutic protocols. This isn't a discussion around what's the most appropriate protocol, but actually where there is lower levels of either clinic time or psychotherapeutic support, they will support a better chance of receiving reimbursement from national payers. Approval in HTA doesn't mean you get access. You have to look at the local situation as well, and it's critical to align as closely as possible with existing pathways of care. That's not going to be feasible for all psychedelic therapies and their conditions that they're looking to support, but where there is an existing pathway that you can build upon, that will be a much better route through for getting access. And on all of these things, stakeholder dialogue is needed, and it's needed early rather than later, because these things will take years of discussion, not weeks of discussion, to work through. I'm going to skip that one for time. So some key recommendations. So from the report, we have some recommendations for drug developers. I've selected out a few here, which are pertinent for the UK. Where there are accelerated pathways or pathways for innovative medicines, they should be tapped into. The ILAP program in the UK allows early discussion amongst stakeholders. Developers need to engage very early with payers, payer assessors, and they can do that from years in advance to align on what's the type of evidence that they need to provide. It's all about comparative value for the UK. The best way to do that is head-to-head studies. If that's not possible, it needs to be looked at very carefully to see if payers are going to accept that evidence pack. And also a plan for long-term evidence, right from the start. That's not going to be available at launch, but a plan on showing how that evidence will be collected over the medium to long term to show those patient outcomes is going to be critical. Some recommendations for healthcare stakeholders and policymakers. We think there needs to be a focused review around HTA methodology and how that fits with psychedelic therapies coming through, and have those methods optimized in advance of the therapies arriving. There needs to be an investment in facilities, of course. We think it's critical that pilots are looked at. Rather than try and roll this out nationwide immediately, identify pilots which look to develop an efficient model and then scale that out to the UK more broadly. And there is a role here for more than just the NHS. So there are private and charitable stakeholders and enterprises, especially in mental health, operating within the UK. And there's definitely an opportunity for partnerships between these different groups to help with infrastructure and scale and supporting the rollout of these medicines. And some key recommendations here for patient groups and clinical groups. And this is specifically in the context of how they might support reimbursement. And these therapy evaluations through HTA, they are built around getting insights from physicians and patient groups, but they have to proactively submit those their inputs into the process, and that's going to be critical. And that definitely needs to happen, and we need to make sure that these groups are aware of where they can input into the process to support the appropriate evaluation. And also support networks is going to be key. Not all the support network piece can be done around the clinical trials. Henry was talking about the limitations of how much support is in the protocol. So there needs to be a significant effort in understanding how that will be put in place and not discussed while the HDA is happening. So just to wrap up, these challenges all involve multiple stakeholder discussions and working groups. So we would definitely encourage the continuation of existing working groups, but probably some particularly focused working groups to look at how to partner to implement these therapies. We think there is a good discussion to be had or needs to be had around conditional funding, like conditional reimbursement while additional evidence is collected over the first few years of a therapy being in the market, which doesn't happen very often in the UK at the moment. And also a look at flexible payment models. So rather than payers taking all the risk, as they would see it, of an upfront cost, having payment which is related to the outcomes that the patients achieve and trying to, what the industry would term, a risk share to make sure that no one's taken too much of the risk up front when the therapies are quite new and have uncertainty around them. So if you'd like to go deeper into the topic, there is quite a lengthy report available at psychedelicsandreimbursement.com. It's free to access, and also there's an opportunity for feedback there, or to share areas where you think there's potential for collaboration on some of these items. And the overall view here, and Floris and I will be working on this moving forward, is efforts to turn these reimbursement challenges into some very clear, actionable pathways for the UK and for other countries as well. Thank you for your time.